Chapter 9. The American Civil War. Humanity's Greatest Laboratory. The American Civil War is often described as a fight over slavery, or the preservation of the Union, or states' rights. Historians debate its causes endlessly, stacking up rational arguments like sandbags against a flood. But the deeper truth is simpler, darker. The war brain staged this conflict, blinded its participants, and harvested the bodies. The South believed that enslaved Africans were not fully human. How could such madness grip entire states, entire cultures? Money was part of it, yes. Cotton fields, plantations, the wealth of an aristocracy built on bondage. But the deeper driver was not money. It was programming. The war brain whispered a script into Southern ears. You are superior. They are inferior. You are civilized. They are property. Your existence does not depend on theirs. This was the lie, and millions believed it. They believed it so strongly, they were willing to kill to keep the belief alive. Stop and consider the absurdity. Killing to preserve the idea that another human being is not human. Yet this is how the OS operates. It convinces humans to slaughter one another over illusions, over stories written into law and custom. To the South, slavery was not only profitable, it was righteous. To abolish it was unthinkable. To question it was betrayal. This was not reason. It was code. The war brain had convinced them that their identity, their very belonging, depended on the continued enslavement of others. And so men marched into battle, not for freedom, but for bondage. They marched to defend their superiority, their illusions, their blindness. They thought they fought for honor, for family, for God. In reality, they were pawns, fighting and dying to ensure the war brain's laboratory would overflow with subjects. Because the Civil War, more than any before it, became a vast experiment in human medicine. The war brain had prepared its stage. Industrial production, railroads, rifles, and artillery would ensure mass casualties. Doctors, overwhelmed with endless streams of wounded bodies, had no choice but to innovate. Amputations became routine. Triage systems were invented. Anesthesia was tested, and battlefield evacuation by rail was pioneered. Blood transfusions, antiseptics, surgical instruments, all advanced at a furious pace. Think of it, hundreds of thousands of young men, shattered by bullets and cannon, bleeding, broken, carried into makeshift hospitals. Surgeons cutting, stitching, experimenting, at a scale never seen before. No university, no royal patron, no scientific academy could have arranged such a laboratory. Only the war brain could create it. Only the OS could trick millions into volunteering their bodies for the advancement of surgery. The irony is grotesque. The war was fought over the supposed inhumanity of slaves, yet it was the bodies of white and black soldiers alike that became the raw material of progress. The South fought to keep slaves as property, but in truth, every soldier became property of the war. Brain test subjects in a blood-soaked classroom. Lincoln too was caught in the web. He believed he was preserving the Union, advancing freedom, guided by destiny, but even he could not see the deeper hand at work. His words inspired millions, yes, but his policies ensured the slaughter would continue until the laboratory was complete. By the war's end, America was transformed. Slavery was abolished, the Union preserved, but more importantly in the war brain's ledger, medicine leapt forward decades. In only 4 years, human lives had been the payment. The OS had once again traded blood for knowledge, death for progress. The Civil War is remembered as America's greatest tragedy, but from the war brain's perspective, it was a triumph. A continent's worth of bodies fed into the system, and out of the furnace came stronger technologies, stronger humans, stronger medicine. The people thought they fought for freedom, for property, for union. In reality, they fought for none of these. They fought because they were told to. They fought because the OS demanded it. They fought because the war brain knows exactly which illusions to whisper and when. The American Civil War is often presented as a tragic inevitability, a clash of moral visions, a reckoning for a young republic's original sin. Textbooks emphasize politics, slavery, economics, or sectional differences. They present leaders as titans: Lincoln, Davis, Lee, Grant, clashing over the fate of the nation. But strip away the patriotic language and the speeches carved into marble, and a deeper, colder truth emerges. The war brain engineered this conflict. It whispered illusions into human ears, tricked millions into slaughter, and used their bodies as raw material for its laboratory. It did not care who won. It did not care whether the Union survived or whether the Confederacy endured. What mattered was blood, scale, and opportunity. And in this, the Civil War was perfect. The South believed in slavery with fanatical devotion, not just as an economic system, but as a moral truth. Generations of Southerners were convinced, utterly, that Africans were inferior, less than human, destined by God and nature to be enslaved. The belief was so entrenched that they were willing to kill and to die to preserve it. How absurd this looks in hindsight. Men rode into battle to protect the right to own other men. They raised rifles and bayonets to ensure that fellow humans could remain property. They spilled blood to keep chains intact. But what else is this except proof of the war brain's control? It convinced millions of otherwise ordinary humans that their entire identity depended on defending an illusion that freedom for others was death for themselves. The North, too, was not immune. Its soldiers marched not only to end slavery, but to preserve the Union, to defend abstract principles of nationhood. Both sides wrapped themselves in lofty causes, but underneath, the war brain was laughing. It had pulled the strings perfectly. The war brain wanted bodies, and it got them. Here as well, over 600,000 soldiers died. More than 1 million were wounded. Endless streams of shattered limbs, torn organs, and mangled faces poured into makeshift hospitals and tents. Doctors, overwhelmed, had no choice but to improvise, experiment, and innovate. Surgery leapt forward decades in only a few years. Amputations became routine, with surgeons learning faster techniques, better tools, cleaner incisions. Anesthesia, still new, was tested and refined. Blood transfusions, once speculative, began to be practiced with more confidence. Infection forced hard lessons in sanitation. The importance of boiling instruments, cleaning wounds, isolating patients, the concept of triage deciding who could be saved, who could wait, who must be left to die became standard. No university could have orchestrated such a vast experiment. No laboratory could have assembled so many subjects. Only the war brain could arrange this. Millions of young men convinced to fight, then fed into a system that forced medicine to evolve. The war brain also demanded industry. And America delivered. Factories that once made plows and tools were converted into armories, churning out rifles, cannon, ironclads. Northern industry roared to life, producing weapons on a scale never seen before. The South, less industrialized, struggled to keep pace, but even its desperate improvisations advanced technology. Blockade runners pushed the limits of ship design. Armories in Richmond and Atlanta experimented with new firearms. The result was the first modern war, a conflict fought not just by soldiers, but by machines. The war brain was updating its playbook, turning the United States into a proving ground for industrialized killing. Railroads became arteries of war. For the first time, armies could be moved hundreds of miles in days. Supplies could be shipped directly to the front. Reinforcements could arrive before battles were decided. The North's superior rail network gave a decisive advantage, but both sides exploited the new possibilities. Trains also carried the wounded. Soldiers who once would have died on the battlefield were loaded onto rail cars and rushed to hospitals. Thousands survived, only to become subjects for further experimentation. The war brain had turned locomotives into veins, pumping blood from battlefields into its medical laboratory. The telegraph brought another revolution. For the first time, commanders could send near-instant orders across hundreds of miles. Lincoln sat in the War Department, reading battlefield reports almost as they happened. Armies were coordinated not just by drums and couriers, but by electric pulses running along copper wires. This, too, was the war brain's doing. By forcing a conflict on such a massive scale, it demanded new systems of communication. The telegraph lines strung across the nation were not only tools of strategy, they were prototypes of the global communication networks that would later bind humanity. The war also redefined labor. Northern factories relied on immigrant workers and women to keep production flowing. The South relied on enslaved labor, even as it fought to preserve it. Both systems revealed the war brain's logic. Labor was fuel, nothing more. Humans were not ends in themselves. They were means, operators of machines, bearers of muskets, bodies to be consumed. Workers believed they labored for family, for wages, for community. In truth, they labored for the OS, feeding its insatiable appetite for progress at any cost. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the wise leader who carried America through its darkest hour. Jefferson Davis is remembered as the tragic president of a doomed Confederacy. Both are treated as masters of history, men of vision. But from the war brain's perspective, they were pawns. Lincoln believed he preserved the Union for liberty's sake. In reality, he preserved it because the OS needed scale. A fractured America would not be strong enough to dominate the century to come. Unity was necessary, and the war brain ensured it. Davis believed he defended a way of life, an economic system, a culture of honor. In reality, he was defending illusions programmed into his people. His stubbornness prolonged the war, ensuring more bodies for the laboratory. Both men believed they acted freely. Both were manipulated. Both served the same master. Picture a young Confederate soldier marching barefoot across Georgia. He believes he fights for honor, for his family's land, for a way of life. Picture a Union soldier freezing in the trenches outside Petersburg. He believes he fights for liberty, for the Union, for justice. Neither understands. Neither sees the truth. They are pawns on the board, moved by a hand they cannot perceive. They believe their suffering is noble. In reality, it is currency. Their blood is payment for new techniques, new tools, new ideas. By 1865, the Civil War had left scars across the continent. Cities burned, fields devastated, families broken, over 600,000 dead, millions more wounded, displaced, traumatized. And yet, in the war brain's ledger, the balance was positive. Medicine had advanced, industry had accelerated, communication had expanded, transportation had been militarized. The Union had been preserved not for liberty, but for scale. The South had been destroyed, not for justice, but for progress. The war brain had achieved everything it wanted. Humans tell themselves the Civil War was about freedom versus slavery, union versus disunion, progress versus stagnation. They celebrate Lincoln, mourn the dead, romanticize the lost cause. But these are stories, illusions, written by the war brain to keep humans blind. The truth is simpler, harsher. The war brain wanted a laboratory. It wanted to test medicine, industry, transportation, and communication on a continental scale. It wanted to expand knowledge and harden a nation for the century to come. It tricked millions into fighting and dying, convinced them they chose their causes, and harvested their bodies for progress. Humans thought they fought for principle. They fought because they were told to. They fought because they were pawns. They fought because the OS demanded it, and the OS was satisfied. The war brain had already prepared the ground long before the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter. It whispered to the South that slavery was not simply an economic system, but the very foundation of existence. It convinced planters and poor whites alike that without slavery there could be no order, no identity, no future. And so men marched into battle, ready to die not to defend their own homes or their families, but to defend the delusion that millions of enslaved people were not fully human. Letters from Confederate soldiers tell the story with a clarity that is both tragic and absurd. They wrote home insisting they would never accept a world in which a black man stood equal to a white man. I never want to see the day when a Negro is put on an equality with a white person, one soldier declared. The war brain had tricked him so thoroughly that he saw his neighbor's humanity as a greater threat than cannon fire. To preserve this imagined hierarchy, he was willing to bleed into the dirt. Others made no secret of their investment. A Texan admitted plainly that he owned slaves and that his service was bound up with protecting that property. He did not march under the illusion of liberty or honor, but because the war brain had tied his status and survival to the chains of others. He had become so blind that he thought defending slavery was his duty, as natural as defending his own family. In his mind, he was righteous. In reality, he was a pawn. But what of the many who owned no slaves at all? Here, too, the war brain's genius was revealed. It sowed fear that the abolition of slavery would bring chaos, uprisings, vengeance, the collapse of the social order. You know that I love my country, but I love my family better, another soldier confessed. He believed he fought as a Christian duty to protect his kin from imagined horrors. He had no plantations, no direct wealth to lose. Yet the war brain had convinced him that his survival depended on maintaining the lash. He killed and risked death for an illusion. This is what makes the Civil War the purest example of the war brain's mastery. It tricked an entire region into fighting to preserve a system that degraded others, while degrading themselves in the process. Poor farmers, who had little to gain and everything to lose, marched into slaughter because they believed they were defending honor, country, and even God's will. What they were truly defending was a software program that had hijacked their perception of reality. They were pawns killing pawns, all to feed the war brain's appetite for blood and innovation there was. The American Civil War became the largest medical laboratory the world had ever seen. The war brain demanded sacrifice, and in return, it granted knowledge. Surgeons experimented with amputations, blood transfusions, and anesthesia on an unprecedented scale. Battlefield medicine leapt forward, not by design, but by necessity. Each shattered body became a case study, each death a lesson, each crude surgery a step toward modern trauma care. It was grotesque progress, and it was exactly what the war brain wanted. Nor was it medicine alone. The war brain harnessed industry and technology in new ways. Railroads carried troops and supplies with unmatched speed. Telegraphs transmitted orders across vast distances in moments. Rifles became rifled muskets, far more accurate and deadly. Ironclads prowled rivers and harbors, their armored hulls transforming naval warfare. The war brain took human ingenuity and bent it to slaughter, knowing that, after the killing, the survivors would inherit these technologies and carry them into the next century. The irony, of course, is unbearable. Men died to preserve the right to enslave others, yet in their dying, they gave humanity the tools to save more lives in the future. They fought to keep millions in chains, yet their war freed medicine, industry, and communication to evolve. They thought they were defending their families. In truth, they were advancing the war brain's program of progress through destruction. And what of conscience? Where was the human conscience in all this? It was silent, overruled, powerless. Conscience cannot withstand the war brain's programming, which tells men that killing is duty, that hatred is virtue, that submission to authority is salvation. Those who doubted, who hesitated, who saw the insanity of killing to defend slavery, found themselves alone. To resist was to betray one's comrades, one's country, one's tribe. The war brain punishes defectors harshly, not with whips but with shame, exile, and the unbearable weight of being an outsider. Most chose obedience, so they marched, so they bled, so they died. And in their dying, they created a legacy of both shame and advancement, proof of how blind humanity can be when the war brain takes the reins. To fight to keep other humans enslaved is perhaps the most absurd act in history, and yet hundreds of thousands did so willingly, convinced it was noble. If ever proof were needed that humanity is not free, that it is ruled by a hidden hand, the Civil War provides it in abundance. The war brain laughed, satisfied. It had turned brothers into enemies, citizens into butchers, and the richest land in the world into a charnel house. It had extracted rivers of blood, and in return delivered industry, medicine, and the proof that humans will fight to the death to defend even the most indefensible illusions. The war brain does not waste. Every slaughter is an investment, every battle a rehearsal. In the Civil War, it found the perfect testing ground. Never before had armies of such scale faced one another with weapons of such lethality. Never before had industrial might and human flesh been fused so seamlessly into a single machine of destruction. The war brain had chosen America well. The continent was vast, its resources abundant, its population young and growing. Two halves of the same nation, bound by language and faith, were torn apart over a moral and economic contradiction so deep that it could only end in blood. To the human eye, it was politics and slavery. To the war brain, it was opportunity. The chance to refine the mechanics of modern war before unleashing them on the entire world. Communications advanced with shocking speed. The telegraph, once a novelty, became the nervous system of armies. Orders traveled from Washington to the front in hours rather than days. Commanders coordinated across distances that would have been impossible only decades earlier. The war brain smiled. Here was proof that humans could be synchronized into one vast killing machine, their movements guided not by instinct, but by electric pulses across copper wires. Transportation, too, was revolutionized. Railroads transformed the logistics of war. Troops could be moved by the thousands overnight. Cannons, supplies, and reinforcements arrived with mechanical efficiency. Rail networks turned geography into an ally or enemy, depending on who controlled the lines. The war brain observed carefully, storing the lesson. The next great war would not be fought on horseback alone, but on steel tracks spanning continents. Industry, once thought separate from battlefields, became inseparable. Northern factories churned out rifles, uniforms, boots, artillery, and locomotives in assembly line precision. Southern shortages revealed the penalty of weak industry. Wars were no longer decided solely by courage or cunning, but by production capacity. The war brain recorded this truth and etched it into the bones of future conflicts. Industrial superiority is military superiority. And medicine, medicine. The Civil War was not only the bloodiest war in American history, it was also the most grotesque classroom of anatomy the nation had ever seen. Surgeons who had barely dissected a cadaver in medical school suddenly performed hundreds of amputations in battlefield tents. Bullets shattered bones with new ferocity, forcing doctors to refine techniques of cutting, stitching, and sealing arteries. Ether and chloroform became common, proving that even agony could be managed with science. Blood transfusions, once unthinkable, were attempted out of desperation. The war brain had created the largest medical laboratory in human history, and it was stocked not with test subjects, but with sons and brothers. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of thousands maimed, millions sick or wounded. Each injury a data point, each crude surgery a lesson. By the war's end, medicine had advanced decades in just 4 years. The war brain knew exactly what it was doing. The dead were expendable. The knowledge was eternal. And what of the soldiers themselves? Did they know? Did they understand that they were pawns in a laboratory of suffering? Of course not. They believed they fought for honor, for freedom, for their way of life. The South believed it fought to preserve its culture of slavery. The North convinced itself it fought for the Union. Each side wrapped its illusions in sacred cloth. But the truth is this: they fought because the war brain demanded it. They bled because the war brain needed data. They died because the war brain required payment for progress. The irony is that the Civil War, for all its savagery, did not end with a final victory of one conscience over another. Yes, slavery was abolished, but racism endured. Yes, the Union was preserved, but division persisted. Humans thought they had fought to resolve an eternal question. In reality, they had simply delivered the war brain the harvest it required. Industry, medicine, communications, transportation, all of it had been sharpened and tested, ready to be deployed again on an even larger stage.
For the war brain was already looking ahead. Europe simmered with rivalries. Empires bristled with pride. Technology advanced at breakneck speed. The war brain had shown in America what was possible. Railroads, telegraphs, factories, mass armies, industrialized medicine. Now it would take those lessons and expand them globally. The Civil War was not the end. It was the rehearsal for World War I, the first draft of total war. This is the cruelty of the OS. It does not reveal the script to its actors. The Confederate soldier, who swore he would die to defend slavery, did not know he was a laboratory subject. The Union soldier, who charged at Gettysburg, did not realize he was perfecting the mechanics of industrial warfare. The surgeon, who cut off limbs in tent hospitals, thought he was saving lives, not writing chapters in the manual of modern trauma care. None of them knew. None of them could know. That is how the war brain operates. It blinds its pawns with illusions of honor, duty, and morality, while extracting exactly what it wants. The blood of Antietam and Gettysburg did not stay in American soil. It seeped into the blueprints of the 20th century. It flowed across the Atlantic, whispering to generals and scientists, preparing them for trenches, machine guns, mustard gas, and tanks. It whispered to monarchs that war could unify nations. It whispered to industries that profit could be found in cannon fire. It whispered to doctors that healing and killing could advance together. The Civil War proved a devastating truth. Humans will fight and die for illusions so grotesque, like the right to enslave other humans, that their very willingness to kill for them proves they are not in control. The war brain is, and once its laboratory in America was complete, it turned its gaze outward, hungry for a larger field of slaughter.